Thank you so much, Dr. Chan, for being with me here today and with my audience.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I love your book, The Seven Principles of Nature, and how we strayed, how we return. There are so many concepts in here that resonate very deeply with my own experiences, both in neuroscience and helping people through different journeys, as
Hmm.
well as I was mentored by a professor many years ago at NYU on meditation and the effects on the brain. So I ended up being in monasteries and working with
Wow.
monks and living with them for a little while just to see how life played out.
Hmm.
We'll talk a little bit about how your book kind of reflects different approaches to all of that.
Hmm.
But yeah, I just wanted to start by saying like it just resonated really beautifully with so many of my experiences. So thank you. Um, so what I'd love to, I always start with just your journey and how you got to where you are, and maybe even why you felt the need to write this book at this time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a bit of a long journey, but let me see if I can say it in a few minutes. I've always been fascinated by the intersection of neuroscience and psychology. And the direction it took me in was, of course, attending Pepperdine University and specializing in neuropsychology and moving on to, externships and internships at, hospitals like Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and so forth. But I always felt like there was an element that was lacking. And the element that was lacking to me was it comes from the contemplative sciences.
Mm, yeah.
And at the time, it was just becoming very popular in the West Coast with my own mentor, Dan Siegel, and
Hmm.
and Lou Cozolino and Alan Shore. And mainly Dan Siegel was sort of the spearhead to a lot of the mindfulness based science. And so he brought me deeply into the that realm. Now, that said, I was already into it. I was specifically interested in Zen Buddhism and Taoism, and I'd always been interested in practicing, but I never actually knew what the science was behind it. And so that was the element that Dan really brought into my life.
Hmm.
Now, I've mainly been exposed to the Western intellectual traditions. And that's been the greater, proportion of my own training, whether it was the science or whether it was philosophy. And given that I am Chinese, and my family and grandmother and other grandparents had all sorts of different belief systems, I was always interested also in expanding my reach and becoming a little more creative in my thinking, seeing how can
Hmm.
I, add to the puzzle that we're all working on together.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I was, practicing meditation. Then I ran into Dan, and then, one thing led to another, and I started doing some work with him, and we published a paper on mindfulness. And um, eventually, the first book that came out was more so a compilation of things that I've learned from Western traditions, reassembling models of reality, and it was more of a textbook really for doctoral
Hmm.
students. But when I completed that book, I was, well, now thinking, well, maybe I should expand into the Eastern traditions. And
Hmm.
I've already been interested in it. It's in my roots and in my blood, we might say. And
Hmm.
so I started delving really deep into it. Now, I'm not so full of myself that I thought I could do this alone. So I definitely reached out to lots of individuals, specifically people from Brown University, who has a very good contemplative
Hmm.
program, people like Larson D. Fiore, and actually Dan recommended I look into the work of Harold Roth um, and Lou Comyathi, and there are many others. And I also reached out to a few people, such as Deng Ming Dao, who's a popular Taoist independent writer, and Ray Grigg as well. And so I was able to network and meet with all of them. I forgot to mention Livia Cohn. Sorry, just name dropping,
Love
like
it.
I put
Absolutely.
a whole
Yes.
team together to make sure that I wasn't
Hmm.
making mistakes in this book, to make sure that it was, still academically sincere. Um,
Hmm.
because that's the component that I wasn't necessarily formally educated on, but I was
Right.
definitely I'm an autodidactic when it came to that sort of thing. So that's where that's where that side of the picture came in. And what really drew me in was the intersection really between the Taoist writings and evolutionary theory, specifically
Mm,
mismatch theory. And
mm,
for those of you out there who don't know what that is, to put it as simply as possible, um, we're we're living in a world that we did not necessarily originally evolve to live in. Maybe we could put it like that. And
I
that
love that.
is really what a lot of the Taoist writing was about, that we were living in a way that was unnatural, that we were falling for what was artificial. And it's only now that we're finding all of these challenges that we're facing. And I thought that was, I grew very passionate about that. And it's very important nowadays, especially with, for example, well, technology and AI. And we don't know how it's reorganizing the ways that we interpret information and process information. We don't entirely know about the consequences. And I think the exact same thing happened with the agricultural revolution 10 at 10,000 BCE.
Mm,
Sounded like a
mm,
great idea at the time, but they didn't know that it would lead to, increased disease, increased sedentary living that would, impact their physical health and all sorts of other things. And I think it's a similar thing that's happening now. And so I thought it was well, number one, history is repeating itself, and I guess number two, I thought it would be a great way to bring it into the conversation. And so,
love that. Yeah, wow, what a beautiful, rich journey. I met Dan Siegel many years ago I spoke at a conference he spoke at called Bridging the Hearts and Minds of
oh
Youth, and it
wow.
was about mindfulness at UCSD.
Hmm.
He's also been a very big influence in my life. That's really wonderful to hear.
Hmm.
So now, the term that really stood out for me in your book, well, actually two things. The first was I'm more exposed to Buddhist type of thinking because I was in those monasteries and I didn't really know the difference or know a lot about Taoism. So could you just say a little bit about what you feel are some of the kind of the essence of those and how they maybe overlap or differentiate themselves?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so there are similarities and there are differences. And I think, as you mentioned, most people are familiar more so with Buddhism. But so here's one difference. For example, one of the core aims in Taoist practice is to be not liberated, let's say, from our natural condition, as a Buddhist might say, but to be more embedded within the
Mm,
natural principles. It's
mm,
more practical. There are abstract elements for sure, but it tends to be more practical for the people, whereas Buddhism, some would say, is a little more abstract. Those are
hmm
the
hmm
two differences about the two, and Taoism emphasizes concepts like Wu Wei, which is effortless action. Some people
mm.
say, uh, action through non-action, but effortless action is, I think, a better way to put it.
I love
And we can
that. Yeah.
talk more about that later. It's directly connected with flow, which is
hmm
a probably more familiar concept to people in the West. Um,
it's I love that distinction and it was something I wasn't too familiar with because it reflects also into many of the circles that I'm a part of where we talk about the mind brain body connection, obviously that a lot of people talk about that as well, but just this idea of being rather than going abstract and really conceptual, which is this layer out in a sense, this attempt to translate things, coming back into our real lived experience, our flesh.
mm,
And I work a lot with AI organizations, and something that I I use a word that gets them to perk up, which is we are mammalian also. We're mammals, and
mm,
our flesh and pressure and heat and warmth and temperature and those senses are so important part of our intelligence, really. But
mhm,
when a lot of people in those circles, they're going very cognitive, very intellectual, very language based, because
mhm,
AI is really about the graphical symbols we used to try to insert like input as our experience, but is not our
mhm.
actual flesh experience. Do you feel like the Taoism, does that kind of correlate a little bit with that idea?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. So that's actually another distinction, I would say, between Buddhism and Taoism. For Taoism, the body is very, very important.
Mm.
And actually, what's kind of interesting in the Chinese language, the word we use for mind is in Cantonese, it's sam, which actually means heart, and some people translate it to heart mind. And so,
Oh.
it's already this idea of cognition being embedded within the body
Mm.
is already a sort of a part of the very language in Chinese actually in Taoism.
Yeah.
And taking care of your body and embodied intelligent, all of that is a very big part of the Tao. Even so, here's another thing, when and I know I'm kind of jumping around a bit, but
It's okay.
when in Taoism, when you are meditating, one of the core focuses of awareness is around the abdomen region.
Mm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so it's
Hmm.
this continual, link between where we think our brain mind is and but also understanding the connection with the gut. And as you
Yeah.
probably are aware of, our gut brain is highly intelligent, far more than any of us have thought before. There are more
Yeah.
connections from our gut going up to our brain than our brain going down to our gut. And changes to the gut can lead to changes in personality even and in emotion and even cognition. And so it's
Mm.
now overly simplistic for us to just think of the mind as solely the brain. So
Yeah. And it reflects also into my experiences working at a neuropsychology clinic where for particularly for young, it was for emerging adults. They were 17 to 25 years old. Something
mhm,
that a lot of them were experiencing was this disconnection from their body. This they
mm,
just felt so entranced kind of by their own thoughts and getting so lost in there. And I don't even think they knew they wanted to be back in their body, but they didn't like being out in that space of just their thoughts constantly. So I
mhm,
feel like this topic really it's just so important. It's so resonant for a lot of people who I think do feel very lost in that some other world almost, like not so much in their body. And
yeah.
yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And here's where I'm going to delve into another area I think you might be interested in, right? And
Yeah.
that is, of course, the default mode network, which is
Yeah.
a particular interest to me. My dissertation was on it, and I've written a fair amount on it. And when we are lost in our own thoughts, when we are daydreaming, mind wandering, well, our default mode network is active. It's a neural network in our brain comprised of multiple regions working together in synchrony that relates to functions like mental time travel, others, and the self. So Dan calls it the oats network for others and the self, but I was like, Dan, you're missing the mental time travel. So let's call it the moats network. So I've been calling
Love
it the
that.
moats network, and
Yeah.
that's where that comes from. Um, and so for me, the when that DMN, short for default mode network, became, let's say, coherent and apparent in humans, is when I believe the separation really from
Mm.
nature and from our bodies actually began to occur.
Mm.
So that's sort of illustrated
Interesting.
in the first few chapters regarding what I call the SAD theory for separation, alienation, and discord. The
Yeah.
separation component, right, begins with the evolution of the DMN. And, it likely occurred around the same time where we see, cave paintings and other sort of abstract symbolism that's now
Mm.
evident in Neanderthals as well as other species. And the interesting thing, though, to note and it's important to note this, is that separation doesn't necessarily mean alienation or discord. That's why I created a different phase out of that, because separation,
Yeah.
things separated can be in harmony, right? If you
Yeah.
have multiple instruments in an orchestra playing together, it sounds amazing, right? But then
Hmm.
sometimes, someone's out of tune or someone hits a wrong note. And when it comes to the world of musicians, hitting a wrong note can really throw everybody off,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a nice metaphor for I think I guess where we're headed maybe in this conversation, but also what's happening in society where we're becoming more and more alienated and in discord with um, well with natural principles, which
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I would love to kind of go into now is maybe just a quick overview of the seven principles, just a
sure.
kind of a list so people hear it, and then maybe we can dive into each of them. And I also definitely want to talk about the neurodynamic
Right.
theory.
Thank
I
you.
think that's
Yeah.
wonderful. So yeah, I have your book right here. Also, just so people, if they're already ready to kind of read along, it is Seven Principles of Nature, and we're just kind of we're still at the beginning of it really right now, what we're talking about. So yeah, if you can just give a little overview of those seven principles.
Yeah, sure. So here's something that'll make it easy to remember. It does spell out an acronym, and the acronym is CPR West. And of course, it was intuitive because I came up with the principles first, and then I was trying to scrabble a word together, and
Hmm.
I'm like, oh wow, this works so perfectly, CPR West. And
Yes.
the first principle is creativity. I don't think anyone would really argue that nature is creativity. It's in a
Right.
constant process of creation,
Yeah.
and there's all sorts of diverse expressions. Nature is process. Nature is relationship. Everything is connected.
Mm.
The W on West is wholeness. Nature consents to everything, and so
Hmm.
it's open to, the to poop on the ground to the most, beautiful animal that you can think of.
Yeah.
Um, it's Equilibrium is another part to it, and that's something that's slightly deceptive in its name, and maybe we could talk about that in a little bit. S is spontaneity, and then the T is transformation.
Love that. Yeah, I would love for us to kind of go, maybe actually if you want to pick the one that you feel lights you up the most to speak about and we can go into all of them. But yeah, what would you
Okay.
say?
Well, I mean, the one most related, I think, well, they're all related to mental health in
Yeah,
some way, of
yeah.
course, right? But I think the one lots of people relate to a lot is the creativity as a principle, and
Hmm.
specifically what sort of comes out of that as an
Mm,
example. So some people might say, okay, so creativity is a principle of nature that permeates all sorts of levels. So what does that mean? So what if nature is creative and there's a part of me that's creative and I'm a creative process? Well, what that means is that if you accept that that is a natural principle, that that is something that is universal and consistent, then that
mm,
invites a certain way of being in the world,
mm,
right?
mm.
Does it invite somebody to be rigid in their belief systems and, static and stagnant in the ways that they move about the world? Of course
Right,
not. It's the exact opposite. Yet lots
right.
of people find themselves, as you mentioned, lost in their heads, lost in theories and principles and and all sorts of things that may not actually connect with nature. And
Mm,
so one of the chapters there would be change. That change is a continuous, it's a constant. And change is actually what I would say is a precondition for balance, right? So
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
to bring it back to the biology component, homeostasis, right? When you're hungry, you become a little bit off balance. You eat some food, you're back to balance, right? And it's as simple as that. And so when we need to change or when something invites us to change, what's our attitude towards it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I love that. I think that to me the creativity aspect, I feel expansion come from that
mm,
and emergence. Dan Siegel's a big on the word emergence, I think too,
yeah,
of us being more comfortable with the fact that everything is creative and building off itself and expanding and evolving. So us trying to always control things by having, which doesn't neglect the importance of routine and structure, and those things can be really wonderful for us. But I think that some people are often in a place where they I like what you how you worded it. What is inviting us right now to change? What is inviting us to be creative?
mm,
And rather than look at it like they need to control and dictate how things are going to play out.
right. And I think we also, just to add there, we also need to think about what's on the ends of creativity, right?
Mm, yeah.
Because creativity on one end, it's stasis. It's like when you're not moving or doing anything, right?
Hmm.
You're just stuck.
Right.
And then on the other end, well, we have chaos, right? And so,
Yeah.
we don't want to just be chaotically, moving about this world. So, just to speak to, what you mentioned about routine and all that sort of stuff, which is of course very important. And
Hmm.
it's also not necessarily just um, uh, you know, becoming an impulse in the moment, let's say. And this sort of touches on spontaneity also, but
Hmm.
it's not like I'm saying to be aligned with this creative principle. Whatever comes to mind, you're just acting on it right away, and that's the creativity. It's like no, no, no,
Right,
that's not how it works.
right.
Um,
Which kind of brings us back to the P, the process, which is that there's a process happening, and
mhm.
so it's not just chaotic, it's not just necessarily random, but these are processes that are unfolding.
Mhm.
So yeah, could you speak a little more to that?
Yeah, yeah. So process is an interesting one. It's kind of hard to define. The best way I could put it is that it's the idea of the of nature as a progression of interrelated events. Right.
Mm.
And as you said,
Uh-huh.
it is semi-structured, right? There is a process to it, and that's sort of also what binds creativity. So all these principles, like I think you're already hinting at, they're all connected, right? We can't really see
Mhm.
one isolated from the others.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to put it in that sense. And for me, what process invites us to do is, well, to be present with the process. And that
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean just be present all the time. We have the ability to mental time travel for a reason. We have the
Mhm.
ability to recall memories for a reason. But when we are recalling a memory, when we are engaged in what we formally call prospection or thinking about the future, be present with those things, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the
Yes.
problem in this case is that some people can be too myopic, where they are just far too not present, but just identified with the now, and what happens there is, well, they become there's a lack of foresight, and there's a lack of direction. And then
Hmm.
on the other end, we have what I say is hyperopia, which
Hmm.
is the exact opposite. Now we're too distanced. It actually described it perfectly. The intellectual who's in their minds and very distant from the actual experience of what's happening. And it's again,
Yeah.
it's sort of finding this in between.
Yes. I think that really stood out from your book, from your work, and I think many of us would resonate with it, is that we're not talking about these either or, like this rigid construct of each of these things. It's really this tapestry. It's these interwoven threads, of
Mhm.
our experience. So it's not one thing or the other that's better or worse. It's they all kind of play a role in these processes, like
Yeah.
having foresight, but also being able to reflect and be here now, but also maybe have goals. And the
Mhm.
process part also stood out to me because there's really interesting brain research. It also goes with incremental theory, which is from Carol Dweck, and she talks about we can be an entity theorist, which is where things are fixed and unchangeable, unacquirable, but we can have an incremental kind of theory of whatever it is, our response to stress, our intelligence, our abilities, and the focus on or the openness to process is such a big part of that, of really leaning in and staying open to, instead of it being, I didn't get that very specific goal that I had in mind, it's about staying open to what am I extracting from this, whatever is happening. If it's a perceived mistake, if it's negative feedback, if it's whatever that is, how is this
Mhm.
still a process for me? How is this, I call it information for iteration. Like, how do
Mhm.
I keep taking this and keep building off of it instead of saying it didn't meet the goal, it didn't meet the end?
Right. Yeah,
So,
that's
and yeah,
beautiful. Yeah,
yeah,
just the in direct relation to that, and I'm also going to knit the creativity element to this also.
yeah.
But so the way I framed, basically, I think what you just said is that there are different modes of being in the world,
Hmm.
and what process brings into the picture is to be discovery oriented versus to be
Yes,
solution oriented or to be goal oriented. And
love
so,
that.
to bring this together with creativity, one of the things that we face when we think about creativity and change, well, is uncertainty, right? And lots of people are fearful of uncertainty. And what
Yeah.
are one of the things that lights up in our brain when we're faced with uncertainty? Well, we talk about the amygdala being lit up, and then the frontal lobes are looking for threats in all these what if situations. And yes,
Mm,
that's one way that we can respond to it. But
hmm.
another way we could respond to it by attuning to this principle of process would be engaging it through this discovery lens,
Discovery. I
right?
love that. Yes.
And so,
Yeah.
um, instead of um, instead of that threat detection mode, instead of that alert emergency mode, now we're engaging in, okay, well, why don't we just look at what's happening in the present? as information and
Hmm.
as energy. We could even,
Hmm.
try and approach it as a scientist gathering data, right? And
Hmm.
when you're a scientist gathering data, you don't want your preconceived notions to, skew your data in some way. And so you're open to anything that comes. And you
Yes.
decide when you have enough information that surfaces. And that is going to reduce the amount of anxiety or whatever
Yeah.
you're experiencing in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the word discovery, the discovery orientation. And to me, it just feels even more open than like a learning orientation, because learning still has a feeling of there's a goal in a way, but
Right.
discovery is just pure discovery. And what's interesting about that is that actually also correlates with this brainwave research where the people looked at someone who had more of this incremental theory, which is, I would say, discovery oriented
Hmm.
versus goal or performance oriented.
Hmm.
And what they see in the self-report, but also behavioral measures, is people with that performance orientation or goal orientation do perceive mistakes and negative feedback or criticism, and I think also unfamiliar situations, but I don't know if that's as much a part of the research,
Hmm.
as a threat. And what happens in the brain, that's a differentiator between the two, is when there is a prediction error. So they believe they were going to perform well and they didn't, or just something that disrupts what they thought was going to happen. And in particular, these ones are about criticism and mistakes, like they did a
Hmm.
mistake in their calculation.
Right.
The brain, there's a wave that happens, the P3 wave, for when there's like that moment of conscious awareness that you did the thing. But the
Hmm.
people with the learning orientation, or I would actually say it's more discovery orientation, their brain actually stays in this activity that goes into deep, sustained processing of the information.
Hmm.
And so then after when they're retested, they perform better and there's a significant increase in their knowledge versus the person who
Wow.
sees it as a threat. The brain has that quick little moment of, oh, this was a prediction error, but then it very quickly shuts down and does not engage in any of that kind of processing. And when they
Oh,
get tested
interesting.
later, they don't do as well. So I feel like that this discovery orientation is part
Hmm.
of like it's helping, it's a reappraisal, it's whatever seeds we can plant right now for people to think about. If you go into whatever situation you're in and it feels like something happened differently than you thought it would, a prediction error or a mistake, if you stay
Hmm.
in that discover orientation, your brain is going to stay more open to actually getting the information it needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, right, about these different orientations. If you're focused too much on the world in this goal-directed way or solution-oriented way, or um, what happens is you become more narrow and more rigid, and your
Mm.
expectations are ultimately going to create this sort of tunnel vision for you, and anything outside the tunnel is not going to be considered.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're open to being discovery oriented, if you're open to harboring an intentional stance of uncertainty, uncertainty keeps you open to possibilities. It keeps you alert.
Yeah.
It keeps
Yes.
you focused. And some people like to say that, um, philosophers like to say this, that you know uh, that when there is or how would I put this? When there is certainty is death of a question. That's the way
Ooh.
I would think it. Yeah. Yeah. There's no longer a
Yes.
question that needs to be asked. And whereas
That's
the
right.
more serious questions that are asked tend to remain open and uncertain
Mm.
and have many, many responses. And those are the questions that the philosophers are more interested in. Those are
Mm.
the ones worthy of continual questioning.
Mm. I
It's a,
love that.
it's a nice sort of reframe or position on that.
Yes. Certainty. Can you say it again? Certainty.
Yeah. Certainty is the death of a question.
Yes. I love that. And that really, to me, corresponds with how the brain actually responds when it's in that mode of n being okay with the uncertainty of it, being
Mm-hmm.
okay that this is just constant iteration and evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So, going now into the relationship piece, I feel is very reflects also the essence of systems thinking and just understanding how connected we are. There's no escaping it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more about the R? of your acronym.
Yeah, yeah. I think the R is, to me, the R is the most intuitive one of the rest of them. In the sense that I think at this point, at least in my mind, I think most people would agree that they know that everything is connected. But the issue is that there's not this subjective experience of that. So there's the
Mm,
intellectual awareness, but there's not that experiential resonance.
mm,
So what that chapter or section really was about was firstly about elaborating on that idea, like, okay, are we actually all connected? And we certainly are. You know,
hmm
our brains, you talked about brain waves earlier on. Our brain waves are in continually synchronizing and desynchronizing with waves in the environment. There's a researcher, George Northoff, who speaks about this as the neuroecological layer of the brain. That
mm,
at its
mm,
deepest layer, it's in continual interaction with the environment. And when we look at different conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar, well, he finds that there are different signatures and changes uh, that you can see within this
mm.
neuroecological layer, different ways in which it's matching or mismatching what's happening around it.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm,
so there's that. There's also, of course, these really cool hyperscanning studies that are being conducted where two people, their brains are being scanned as they're communicating. And what they're finding, not of course, but what they're finding is, well, that when two people are engaged in a deep and engaging conversation, that they find, well, synchronization
mm,
between two brains. And it's just a very beautiful dance, we might say. Uh,
hmm Yes, and I would say too, I worked with a researcher a long time ago who did hyperscanning, and
hmm,
they talked about really the origin of language being part of brainwave synchronization because it's this idea that we're joining together either on a third entity or with each other, and
hmm,
it's a way to gain understanding of something outside of ourselves. That's
hmm.
part of that brainwave synchronization. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and something else that just came up as you were talking about relationship. Oh,
So
yes. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
no, no,
Yeah,
I just wanted a little clarification on that. So it's because of brainwave synchronization that language emerged, like it
emerged.
made it possible, or
Yes. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
interesting theory.
That
Yeah,
they, yeah, it's because particularly when there's joint attention on a third entity,
yeah,
that is when brainwaves also synchronize. So the theory is that
I see. And that
whether
would
you
lead to
say
like agreement of this is
exactly,
X or this is Y.
ex
And, okay, that makes sense. All right.
yes,
Yeah,
right? It makes
yeah, yeah,
sense, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That way you know that you're talking about the same thing. Otherwise, what's the point of language in that
Hmm.
sense? Yeah.
Right, right.
And it's something that only happens later. Like infants don't have that capacity yet because they don't have theory of mind. So when they put a finger, they don't realize there's a point where they finally, when they're pointing a finger and someone looks at the third entity, they realize, oh, we're agreeing on a third entity. So
Hmm.
that kind of lays the foundation of that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, you talked about Dr. Northoff because I saw in your book the other thing that I think is part of this relationship aspect that I think is so important is the relationship of the body and all of those other processes that are happening constantly, because we talk a lot about the brain and, the default mode, the central executive network or executive control and the salience network, very brain related. And I had
Hmm.
an aha after seeing your book of, oh, we kind of don't talk about, I think the subcortical midline structures as being a part of all of this picture.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would love if you could reflect a little more on that as well.
Yeah, so the subcortical midline structures in particular, it's not as well studied as a network as the others, but
Yeah.
it really is born from the work of Jaak Panksepp.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a paper with George. George is a friend of mine, which is, also why we share work together. But in any case, one of the ideas is that for Yak at least, and for George, that consciousness possibly begins as a feeling in the brainstem, right? And this is
Mm.
also echoed in the work of Mark Solms and a few others. But I know there's a lot of disagreement and agreement, and there's all sorts of controversy between, but it's still one of the leading theories we have. And the idea of the subcortical midline structures, to me at least, uh, it 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 relates well with the idea of the fact that we have what Taoists would call an original nature,
Mm,
right? And that
mm,
original nature, how we tap into it would one way would be through, for example, meditation. And one of the things that we find in deep meditation would be, for example, the deactivation of areas within the DMN and a more activation within subcortical regions.
mm.
The same thing
Yeah.
we could say for people I know are very interested in psychedelics these days, right? But one of the
Hmm.
things on LSD or mushrooms or any of these sorts of things, it's a similar thing. The DMN is shut off, or many of the cortical regions are deactivated.
Hmm.
There's some
Hmm.
areas still active, but a lot of them are deactivated, and people experience things like ego dissolution, right?
Mm.
Where
Yeah.
their identity, their what they identify with them, their self disappears. But to be aware that the self disappeared, there must be something still there, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
so the argument I made in the first book was that that's pure consciousness. That's how we distinguish between consciousness and the self. And the consciousness can be thought of the sense of the self,
Mm.
like thinking of it like as a
Hmm.
sense, like our ability to
Yeah.
see vision and all that sort of stuff. So that's one way to think of it. And so
Yeah.
I use the subcortical midline structures as the best possible approximation, we could say, to anything approaching what how Taoist and Zen practitioners describe our
Mm.
original nature.
I love that. And I almost think there would be a lot of people who would say, "Oh, that sounds like that would feel like such a relief to not to have that quieting down of so many of those brain networks and just go into really just pure living, that
Mhm.
physiological idea of living."
Yeah.
But what's interesting too is the other pushback that I get sometimes from people when they're thinking about whether it's meditation or whatever is that disillusion of self in a sense, or the ego, that there's a fear of what would happen if I didn't have that anymore. Would I just disappear into nothingness? Like
Mhm.
what? So I feel like part of your work, I saw a little bit about there's still an importance of individuation, right? Like you're talking about the musical instruments. We still, that it's not, we're not talking about everyone turning into sameness because
Mhm.
that's not nature either.
Mhm.
There is
Right.
differentiation, individuation.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
important.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
So,
so
yeah.
one interpretation from the Tao perspective is that it's not so much the self dies or disappears, but rather we could see it as there was a boundary and that boundary has been lifted, and so it's
Mm.
expanded to integrate a greater portion of who we are
Oh,
at our very base, and
yes.
very base where we tend to a place that perhaps intuition is tapping into, is how we, well, naturally were as perhaps infants or perhaps, that when we were in the womb or whatever it is that we were possibly experiencing.
Yes. I love, and to me that also then now leads into wholeness because we're talking about expanding the boundary in a sense, like
Mm-hmm.
going, yeah, just expansion. Can you say a little bit more about wholeness?
Yeah, so wholeness is really, well, it's all about expanding our perspective and recognizing that we have a very limited perspective.
Mm,
Right.
yeah.
And one of the things that I know you're probably very well aware of, but it's super important in relationship to this, is this idea of the left hemisphere interpreter from the work of
Mm,
Michael Gazzaniga and the split brain studies with Roger Sperry. I'm not going to go through the full study, but the idea is, of course, that we know through studies that our left hemisphere will create all sorts of interpretations and narratives that aren't necessarily accurate, but they're said
mm.
with complete confidence. Right. And so it's this sort of idea that confidence doesn't necessarily correlate with accuracy.
I love that. Yes.
And so a lot of us
Mm,
we fall in love with our narratives and we start losing touch with the actual experience of it all. And as a result, we neglect wholeness. We see a figure amongst a really giant background. And so the
mm,
whole section on wholeness is about, well, how or what can we do to include more perspectives, to bring in more of the background. And
mm,
so there are
mm-hmm,
a few different angles that I approach in that uh, domain. One of them relates to the being open to paradox and understanding what paradox actually is and how it presents to us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's also the
Hmm.
expansion
Yeah.
that I think is really important actually in the neuropsychological field and other fields also, just that we've been operating on this deficit model for such a long time that we're neglecting a whole other side to it, which is
Yeah.
the fact that, well, perhaps there are evolutionary reasons for neurodivergence, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as I talk to, as I mentioned to my classes, perhaps it's the person with ADHD that that was the first one to spark fire, right?
Yeah.
Not the
Right.
neurotypical person, right? Or
Right.
if you were being invaded by I don't know, somebody that was by a tribe that was camouflaging in the back, perhaps it was the neurodivergent person that noticed that and saved everyone. So,
Mm.
and so there's a whole book called The Paradoxical Brain. And so I sort of mined that book and did more research with my team, and we pulled out a bunch of actually cognitive advantages that can be found in
Mm.
many different so-called, diagnoses or conditions as we recognize them today. And so
Mm.
there's another part to it, and it's a pretty big chapter, and also there's also some work on Carl Jung, who
Mm-hmm.
recently popularized by Jordan Peterson and a few others. I was into Jung far before that, but one of the things that he does bring into the picture that's very important is integration, right? This idea of the shadow needing to be integrated and
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily just repressing or suppressing. Repression's unconscious, so consciously suppressing parts of yourself that you don't like. Like,
Mm.
are there ways in which we can actually integrate these aspects into our lives into productive ways, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so one example for a good one, somebody who has, let's say, homicidal tendencies, or they're really sadistic and interested in dissecting things and blood and all that gore, right? Well, what can they do, right? Other than murder
Mm-hmm.
people. That's not going
Mm-hmm.
to be helpful to the rest of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, some things they could, perhaps um, become a butcher, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a
Mm-hmm.
profession that would be using their skills to their
Yeah.
benefit, or maybe they become a surgeon if they're highly intelligent and meticulous as well, and
Yeah.
use those cravings and experiences in a way that's beneficial. And so the whole chapter is about bringing things together, viewing, viewing the world through a larger perspective.
I love that. That makes me think of I worked with a young teen for a while as a counselor, and he was melting things in the classroom at home and getting in a lot of trouble.
Mm,
But everyone kind of just kept labeling him as just being a troublemaker. And I remember having a conversation with him. I guess it was that discovery orientation where I really wanted to know, like, why do you keep melting? People think you're just like fire and you're trying to disrupt. And he just said he loved to see things transform shape.
mm,
So we ended up getting him a chemistry set and he
mm,
got to play with that. And that kind of solved the issue because there
mm,
was just a fascination. I think it's touching on what you're saying of rather this than this either or, and also understanding the wholeness of everything that nature has allowed to happen. There's a sensitivity that someone has that someone else doesn't have, things they notice and are intrigued by, and all
mm,
of it can make these beautiful gifts that we all have in terms of our what we explore in the world too.
mhm,
So I love
mhm.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Mm.
Yeah. And so let's go with the couple more of your that well, we'll finish the acronym if that's okay. We're
Sure,
kind of running
sure.
low on time, but so
It's okay.
equilibrium is your next one.
Yeah, so okay, so equilibrium, this is an interesting one, right? Because when most people think of equilibrium, they think of stasis. They think of, two things that are not moving anymore. But
Hmm.
actually, when I speak of equilibrium from the perspective of nature, it's a dynamic equilibrium. It's a dynamic
Hmm.
balance.
Hmm.
It's actually, in a sense, there's a perfect balance of asymmetry and symmetry. We could say that's combined into one that allows
Yeah.
for necessary movement and progression and change. And so,
Yes.
in order for this to work in connection with process and constant creativity and transformation, right? Well, there needs to be some sort of dynamic equilibrium. Of course, now with dynamic equilibrium, it can also become too chaotic, similarly to creativity, right? And also it can go the other way around, where it is a static equilibrium, which is also not so good for too long of a time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
mhm, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, I just from a practical perspective for people, if they're thinking equilibrium, I think a lot of people hear this word balance and they think it means equal parts of this, or somehow finding this a very static way of balance in their life.
Hmm.
But what you're kind of saying is that, especially in nature, I mean, everything is emergent, everything is constantly changing, that equilibrium doesn't mean a static state. It's very dynamic and adaptive and attuned.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
different for every person.
Right. Right.
There are certain basic needs that, of course, we need. And to bring it even more concrete and maybe helpful for the audience, I came up with another little acronym. It's just SAS, SAS,
Hmm.
but it's
Hmm.
in relationship to desires, right? And
Yeah.
so if we think about, for example, hunter-gatherers, right? Lots of hunter-gatherers, we could say that they were running on a sufficiency mindset, not so much a scarcity mindset that we
Mm.
harbor today.
Hmm.
Even though the problem is that we actually have excess, which is also a paradox, right? We have actually too much stuff going on, but we still
Right.
always want more.
Right.
And so, one way to categorize your desires is by looking, okay, which desires are related to the sufficiency, which ones are related to which are aspirational, and then which ones
Mm.
are selfish. Which ones don't you
Mm.
actually need? Yeah.
I love that.
And so,
Can you say more about the sufficient, like how would someone evaluate if it was a sufficiency? Oh, is sufficiency versus scarcity? Is
so
that kind of?
that was somewhat separate, but I connected the two.
Yeah.
But by sufficiency, I simply mean like what is it that you absolutely need, that's important to you, that you need in the moment, and you can't live without.
Mm.
And,
Yes.
and and then the aspirational would be related, well, to your aspirations. What sort of character are you trying to develop? Are you drawn towards being developed into?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then the selfish ones are everything that exceeds what's actually needed and what's
Hmm.
now just becoming a distraction.
Mm.
It's kind of interesting. Like when we talk about
Yeah.
working memory, this seems like it's off, but it's connected, right?
Yeah.
We only have so much capacity for the amount of choices we can make, right?
Yeah.
That uh,
Yeah.
7 ± 2 items that we can hold in short-term memory, and you know, so really, when it comes to choices, our brain really evolved to make only x amount of choices. We can say seven
Mm.
minus 2 choices, and now we have way too many choices to make, and it's leading to procrastination and problems and inability to focus on the present,
Yeah.
which again,
Right.
if we look at, 95% plus of our species development as hunter-gatherers, there are lots of anthropologists who are studying modern hunter-gatherers and seeing that, when they're doing one thing, they're doing one thing. When they're, you know, hunting, they're
Yes.
hunting. When they're sitting, they're sitting. When they're talking with another, they're talking with another. There's not all
Yeah.
this other stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
our brains evolved in that condition, and we know that through the science that multitasking leads to reduced performance. Again,
Yep.
regardless of how confident you say you are, like I'm a
Yeah.
great multitasker, it's like
Yeah.
likely won't stand the chance of actually showing that you're actually good at it. So
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, those are
That
some thoughts there.
it reminds me, I love those reflections. I think that's a nice simplicity that the SAS model, just to help people have some sort of guideline of how they can think about their choices and what their desires. Um, Being at the monastery, I remember that we would, when there was visitors, everybody or most of the people would like to walk and talk, and the sisters and brothers would say, "We walk or we talk." And we would only do one. And so when they wanted to talk, we would stop and we would talk. And I loved that. It was so playful and cute. And I think it's hard for most of us to be able to do that, but it changed the moment. It changed the conversation. It changed the walking when we only did the one. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Um, so now just continuing on the last. So I kind of feel like even with the equilibrium, it flows well into spontaneity because the equilibrium model also makes me think of a concept called regulatory flexibility, which is when we're regulating our emotions, we're not trying to be calm and collected all the time. It's
Mm,
about range and repertoire and context sensitivity. Are we approaching an opportunity with the right resources? Are we approaching a threat with the adequate, appropriate resources? Um, and so much of that, I think, flows into the idea of spontaneity, as far as I understand it.
yeah.
Can you say a little
Yeah.
more about that?
Yeah, I love how you're bridging all of these with the science. That's great. Um, so yeah, as you're already hinting at again, there is a difference, first of all, between impulsivity and spontaneity.
Mm.
Impulsivity is going to neglect the context, whereas spontaneity is going to take it into consideration. And ultimately,
Mm.
um,
Love that.
for, yeah, and
Yeah.
so for me, the spontaneity is really emerging from pure intuition. And
Mm.
that's a whole intuition's a whole another uh, conversation, perhaps. But I'll just touch on that a little bit because it's so
Yeah.
important. Because intuition is really not seen as very important these days. At least
Yeah.
you don't you go to classes and it's a lot more is focused on reasoning and rather than
Mm.
intuition. And so then
Hmm.
it comes to be is like, well, what is the use of intuition? And in the world of Taoism, Zhuangzi, who's a famous writer in Taoism, he really hints at greater knowledge being more so intuition rather than
Mm.
reasoning, because when we are reasoning with our, conscious minds,
Hmm.
it's very linear and
Yeah.
it neglects the whole, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas for him, the intuitive experience actually takes into consideration far more, right? And so in that chapter, there are two topics I think are really fascinating. One is, well, in what context does it actually outperform analytical abilities? And then,
Mm.
but let's not neglect analysis. That's also important. And so, what context is analysis important? And um, just to give you the short end of it, and if you want to read more about it, you could see all the research that was done there.
Yeah.
When you have all the variables, like all the variables are known, and the problem is simple, um,
Hmm.
then analysis outperforms intuition.
Hmm.
If a situation is complex, but still the majority of the variables, analysis will still outperform intuition. But if a
Yeah.
situation is complex and there are uncertain variables, intuition will
Ah,
almost always outperform. Um, and this.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wow, yes, which I would say I almost would argue most of life is that one. But I guess
Yeah,
there's,
there's a
there's
bigger
constraints.
proportion.
Right, yeah. There's
Yeah.
obviously situations where we know the very yeah, like there's
Mhm.
very specific context for that. That's
Mhm.
fascinating.
Mhm.
Yes. And would you say so in terms of the intuition, to me, I kind of feel like there's a very big body base to that. It's the body, and I think there has been some studies on that where there's like a measure, whether it's like skin conductance or something like that,
Mhm.
heart rate, where the body starts to do it's already reacting to like what it notices in a pattern before the person realizes
Mhm.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. All
Yeah.
the models that are currently pioneering the intuition research today, they're all connected by the definition that I gave. I'm not going to be able to give the perfect definition right now, but
Yeah.
basically, it's a hidden, non-conscious, non-linear, rapid process that's integrating information
Mm,
from our bodies and from multiple regions of the brain. So an example
mm-hmm,
that would be like the somatic marker hypothesis, right, by
mm-hmm,
Damasio, and
mm-hmm,
this area of the brain called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, where it's a convergent zone of multiple signals, and it leads people to have a bodily experience before they make a decision when faced with uncertainty.
mm,
So,
yes.
and then the predictive models and the other models, all of them have this sort of similar element to it. And so intuition's not blind. It's not just random guessing. It's very,
Yeah.
very informed, in fact. But
Yeah.
we have to pay attention to what our intuition evolved for and what we're trying to use it to solve, right?
Mm,
Because we
mm-hmm.
problem solve all the time, but lots of times, again, because of this mismatch between our modern day life and what we actually evolved for, our intuition's obviously not going to be perfectly matched with some of these issues.
Right,
But
right. Yes.
but
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's done a great job answering some of these questions. I mean, we've heard of scientists having aha moments, right, where they just sit
Yeah.
on it, they don't even think about it,
Yeah.
they do something else, and aha, right, and that tends to be, well, that's intuition working its
Yes.
magic.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a way that we can build trust in our own intuition by testing it out, by seeing what feels like an intuitive hunch and playing out what happens after that, see if there's some resonance with what we're trying to do in that moment.
Hmm.
And to me, so spontaneity is very linked with intuition because there's a spontaneity to
Hmm.
the pattern or the whatever the response that's just
Yeah,
happened.
yeah,
Yeah.
intuition and Also, play is a very important one,
Mm,
spontaneity that I mentioned.
yes.
But right before we transition to, let me just mention one more quick
Yeah.
note about the
Yes,
intuition
please.
component. So the other part to it that I think is extremely important, especially today, is the idea of moral intuitionism, because part of the
Mm,
idea of Taoism is that, well, when rules and regulations and when goodness, we start speaking about goodness, comes into our conscious world and we start trying to be good, we lose what is actually good. You're no longer actually
mm,
good when you're trying to be good because you're
mm.
trying. And when you try, you're bound to lose. And so for them, they say, well, you need to let go of all of that. And if you achieve a still mind, well, then you will naturally be aligned with natural principles. And that alignment is naturally going to be positive and actually
Right.
of value in some way and moral, we could say. But they would never
Yeah.
use the word moral, but that's the idea. So my question then in the book was, well, how, is that true? And how do we know whether that's true or not? And so for that, I looked at literature looking at first rats, then I went to monkeys, and then I went to babies, right? Because
Yeah.
babies are nonverbal, and they've done some really fascinating studies, finding that lots of babies will act in ways that are, statistically significant in regards to the fact that their actions are congruent with what we would consider as moral and what is not. And
Mm,
it's crazy to think
amazing.
that even rats, will also be able
Yeah.
to make certain decisions that will just leave you astounded. And those studies are mentioned there. So I just wanted to drop that in.
Yes, I love that. And I feel like that also really interconnects all the other principles you've talked about, where when
Mm.
we meet, when we're talking about that goodness and that moral behavior, there is a connectivity of all of it. And it is creative and it's relational and it's all those things. So those good behaviors would likely reflect so many of those principles, like what you're just
Yeah.
saying of nature.
So yeah, Stephanie, can I just say something here?
Yeah.
It's I want to say that it's not mystical. There's nothing that needs to be mystical about this because I
Yeah.
think most people associate that like, oh, Taoism, and there is mysticism to it. Don't get me wrong. Definitely there's a
Yeah.
Taoist religion, but I'm focusing on the original, early documents. But it's as simple as this, right? Let's say you are meditating, right? And for Taoist meditation, they tend to be apophatic, meaning that it's about emptying the mind, basically.
Mm,
And so
mhm,
let's imagine you're staring at an ocean. And let's say you're in the horizon, you see a mountain with trees and all that stuff, and it's beautiful. And you're breathing in and you're collecting your thoughts every time you breathe in. And when you breathe out, you're facilitating their release. And you're
mm,
just continually emptying your mind as you're watching this horizon.
mhm,
Well, eventually, if you get absorbed enough in that process, your sense of self will dissolve. And you
mm,
see that correlated with reduced posterior cingulate cortex functioning and medial prefrontal cortical functioning. And what happens then is potentially this sense of ego dissolution, right? Where
mhm,
the self now
mhm,
dissipates. And if there is no self anymore, there's just the sense, and
mhm,
you're looking at the ocean and the mountains, you're going to experience that as you, as a part of you, as
Wow.
connected to you,
I
right?
love that.
And
Yeah.
it's as simple as that, like because everything is so rapidly grouped from a sensory perceptual perspective that we lose sight of that tiny, tiny area where just prior to all the grouping was this
Mm,
connected experience. And
mm,
what the meditation allows you to do is to return to that original state that we actually
mm.
begin in and prolong it. And then you can experience the connectedness, not just intellectually, but
Right.
experientially,
Oh,
right?
yes. I love that. And there are people that still have this resistance to an idea of, I would call it even transcendence, and we're going to talk about transformation as your last letter there. But in terms of that experience, which some people would label as mystical, whatever that experience is, and they would still say, well, yeah, but I don't care. I don't care about feeling that. But my argument is always that people get very attached to their thinking and very attached to what feels very familiar to them as I'm just going to keep calculating these thoughts. Like I'm going to keep trying to find the solution to whatever it is I'm trying to do here in
Yeah,
my brain. The thing is that number one, there is a felt experience that we yearn for, and it's dynamic and it's changing, but we don't want to feel icky and stressed
Mhm.
and all that. And so there is a capacity for us using our mind to achieve states that feel quite much like a release or a relief. And I
Mhm.
would also argue that when we are able to shift into different states like that, a very expansive or connected kind of state, that we are opening up our the circuitry in a sense to have more to play with that
Yeah.
isn't just stuck in its very repetitive, kind of hyper-coherent type of whatever it does all the time. So
Mhm.
even if a person doesn't care, in quotes, about having a mystical experience, it actually could really make life better because now
Mhm.
we have just more in the game in terms of
Mhm.
our brain body. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about being closer to the facts,
Yes.
not from an experiential
Yes.
perspective, right?
Yes.
And for those who don't care about it, let them don't care about it. In
Yep.
the Taoism, they say, people who are trying, I'm paraphrasing, but people who try to attune to the Tao is happy to have them. People who reject the Tao is happy not to have them. The
Yes.
way is
Yes.
always with you. Uh,
Yes.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I thought that
And
was.
and I would say too, like for me, that something I bring into some of my logic also when I'm explaining things to people
Mhm.
is that the more attuned we are to the present moment, just like you said, the more attuned we are, the more accurate we are in many ways, because now we're working with raw, live
Yeah,
data and inputs rather
yeah,
than just the predictions that are in our head that filter
yeah,
everything out.
yeah, absolutely. And this is a good point, right? Stillness
Mm.
nurtures potency.
Mm.
It empowers you. It makes you
Love that.
stronger, and not just physically, like your immune system, right? It literally gets stronger
Yes.
with mindfulness, but we know also your cognition improves, executive function, memory, right? Attention. Right? There's
Yes.
so many
Yes.
things that improve when we achieve a stillness of the mind. And so
Yes.
it nurtures, it literally nurtures our very being. And so
Yes.
this is, yeah, it's one of the reasons why, at least when people come to my clinic, most of the CEOs and other executives, they're interested in gaining a competitive edge. And that competitive edge is really through stillness. It's through meditation.
Mm.
Other than, of
Yes.
course, exercising, good sleep, and all the
Yes.
other things that, are talked
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So,
And that also is, I know we're going to wrap up soon, but I just want to say too that I do a lot of maps, so quantitative EEGs. I've been doing that for many years on people. And something that I see, particularly with kind of the executives, the CEOs, the high performers, is they often have an excess of this very high beta type of frequency. And it's often related to the closer the clusters of neurons are that are communicating, the faster the frequency.
mm,
And the thing that they often complain about the most is their inability to like surrender and release. And it's a
mm,
great state to be in for if they're performing surgery or they're doing something like a lot of calculations.
yeah,
But when they want to actually let go or be in relationship with somebody, or it's very hard for them to do that. And so
mm,
this is also again where when we engage in something like meditation, it's allowing for a bit of that stillness to happen in the body, which
yeah,
then gets reflected in those rhythms in the brain. And
yeah.
they're so regulating and nourishing those rhythms.
And
Yeah.
just to build a little bit on what you just said, right? One of the reasons why CEOs they're so good at they can be so good at what they do, but they can be so bad in relationships and in the state of being. Part of it also relates to the fact that the default mode network, when active, it inhibits the central executive network. And when the central executive
Mm,
network is active, it inhibits the default mode network. And so
right.
they're spending too much time developing one network over the other. And
Right. Yeah.
it's how that all kind of comes together, I think.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so again, they're not allowing for the connectivity to
Right.
be as
Where does the excess beta happen? Which area?
it's usually very much the frontal lobe and
Okay.
oftentimes the left front actually
Oh,
is where I
left
see it
tail
a lot.
PFC, and that
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
self-executive. That's a big
Yep.
part of it.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
know. That's why I see it as like colors on the maps when I'm working with them. And
Mm,
then when they do more meditation, that quiets down. And they
mm,
often are very depleted in their slower frequencies, like the alpha.
mm-hmm,
I can see it as like an under elevation below the standard deviations. So
mm,
um, and then lastly, actually, just what you were saying, I had another person on my podcast. She was guided by Antonio Damasio. She was one of his
mm.
mentees,
Cool.
Mary Helen Imordino Yang, and she's done a lot of research on. the connectivity of, and she calls it transcendent thinking, but the
Mm,
connectivity of the default mode with and the salience and the central executive and our ability to toggle and our ability to do both is so
mm,
important. And she was saying that schools, for example, are just so looking out focused, like so external about that.
yeah,
And it would be
yeah,
wise for us to have a bit more of that inner reflection in our
yeah,
schools.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's about neurodynamic balance, right? And
Yes,
it's right now it's imbalanced, and so
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
So lastly, just if we can maybe even intertwine, transformation is your last
mm,
letter, and
mm.
you have your neurodynamic theory,
Yeah.
which I love, which I think is just kind of encapsulates everything we've talked about. But just some last thoughts on that if you have time.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, with transformation, it's really now about nurturing the process when you are aligned with all the other principles and you know what you want to do moving forward. And it involves both a backwards movement as well as a forwards movement, because
Mm,
in order for us to move forward, we do need to integrate the things that worked out for us in our past before we could
mm,
actually consolidate and create something new and build upon the foundations of who we are and what we have.
yeah.
And so transformation is where I start introducing more techniques that people can actually use. I think I put a table there or a chart
Hmm.
and other things that can be helpful and practical. And
Hmm.
then it moves straight into the neurodynamic approach. I heard it's a little bit too uh, out there of a name,
Oh,
but
I love it.
oh, you love
Yeah.
it? Okay, great. Good,
Yes.
good,
Yes.
good to hear the contrast there. So neuro obviously relates to brain, and there is a decent amount of brain science in the book. The Tao is, well, the Tao, and then
Mhm.
dynamic is a play on the word dynamic for like
Yeah.
process. And so I put those all together, and for me, as you said, it kind of encapsulates the rest. And that chapter really is now about applying everything more clinically or more practically. Like how do
Mm.
we, now knowing all this stuff, how do we actually use this in practice in a way that
Yeah.
can be helpful and help ourselves well move forward in greater alignment with natural principles.
Yes, I love that. And for anyone interested in reading the book, I love that part of the book too. And you talk about when there's not enough, like a deficiency of something and an excess. And I find that very helpful to think about real life examples of how this plays out. So I love that.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. Resonates so much with my long journey, also with the brain and body and all of that. What are you working on now, and where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And this was definitely a really fun interview. And
Thank you.
I was initially intimidated. I started looking deeper into your profile. I'm like, wow, she spoke at Google and all these great places, real neuroscientist. And I was like, okay, but it feels so nice to have some camaraderie and resonance
Yeah,
with these things.
I
Um,
agree.
so, I mean, you could find me at an Instagram. I have a pretty li sort of lively account. It's plateaued a little bit, but it's at Dr. Aldrich Chan. Maybe you could put that on the site or
I
something.
will.
I
Yes.
have a YouTube channel where I interview people specifically people who've influenced my work.
Mm,
And so, there's
love
all
that.
sorts of topics there on like free will and consciousness and all sorts of things. George Northoff is on that also, and a few
Hmm.
that I've
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah.
Dan Siegel, of course, and well, there's a list of them. And sorry, I lost you. What was your other question? Oh, what am I
Well,
working on
yeah.
now?
Yeah. What are you working
Right.
on? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So currently I'm working on two research papers. And the main one that's related to the book is sort of introducing an evolutionary psychotherapy that's sort of similar
Mm,
to the neurodynamic approach, but I guess less esoteric and a little more concrete and connected to the science. But
mm.
a lot of it relates to evolutionary mismatch and ways in which we can live as hunter-gatherers without giving up our modern way of life.
Yeah.
And so,
Interesting.
so some of the techniques are sort of mentioned already in the book, like sort of hinted at. For example,
Mhm.
with movement, like when people look at the Hadza, they average 14,500 steps between males and females, the ages of 18 to 75. With Western folks, we average 4,500. And so it's like, well, how can we
Wow.
find the in between? And what the
Yeah.
in between is? Well, it's 7,000 to 10,000 steps, and there's where we find optimal health benefits, right?
Amazing.
And so
Oh,
there,
wow. That's very
yeah.
cool. Yes. I
So
just
there
heard about
are,
that with the
yeah.
7,000 steps. Like for
Okay, cool.
what do you call that? lymphatic drainage.
Ah, okay. Well,
Yeah,
there's another
interesting.
benefit. I didn't hear about
Yeah,
that one, but
yeah.
yeah. So I introduce all sorts of little life hacks and things like that that can be, I think, really, integrated into the field of psychotherapy more. And even
Yeah.
if not just psychotherapy, just, coaching or just general mental health, ways to
Hmm.
simplify your life while remaining in the modern world. So
Yes.
that's
Oh, I
that's
love
really
it.
a big one.
So
Yeah.
good. Okay, so I'll direct people to your website and your book and all of that. And just something to kind of a final thought for me. I remember being a counselor and you were talking about feeling like something was missing from what you had learned. You'd put so much work into different things. And I remember also having a feeling of that whatever you want to call it, spiritual or
Yeah.
mystical or beyond all of this very cognitive, all these therapies and tools, like there was something so missing. And so I was so lucky, I guess, to have these wonderful mentors and influences in my life where I got to explore some of the Eastern, we could call it, but there's a lot of other ways we can word what we're talking about. It's kind of
Yeah.
hard to find words for it, but I
Mhm.
really appreciate what you are doing, and I think people are going to love this book, and I think it's so important for them to have more of this in their life.
Well, I'm
So,
very flattered, and thank you so much
yes,
for having me on this podcast. It was a great pleasure
thank
and
you.
honor to speak to you.
Thank you.